The story opened with a voice resounding through the void, echoing as it cried out the name Murimyong. The protagonist was kneeling upon the ground. At first he had believed the voice descended from the heavens themselves. From that moment onward, a single command had been bestowed upon him. He was to protect that child. That alone was to be his purpose for living. The order had come from Cheon Wui Gang, the head of the heavenly clan. Murimyong remembered gazing at the boy who stood hiding behind Cheon, and he had reflected that this child, the first son Cheon Muriang, was to become his reason for existence. At the time, he had not known that this very boy would one day become the absolute disgrace that would bring ruin upon the heavenly clan. Murimyong had bowed deeply and declared that he would follow his lord's command without fail. 15 years later, the clan head passed away without warning. In the aftermath, Muriang's degeneracy only deepened. The clan's influence, once ranked among the top 10, withered almost overnight. Members and allies began to abandon the heavenly clan one by one. Yet Murimyong remained. He stayed steadfastly at Muriang's side, devoting his life as the young master's bodyguard. He was always shielding the man who in truth behaved like nothing more than a coward. Then on a rain-soaked day, two figures appeared at the front gate. Before Murimyong could react, Muriang plunged a sword into his back. He was overcome with absolute shock at Muriang's betrayal. Collapsing onto the ground, he could think only one bitter thought: was this blade the sole recompense for his unwavering devotion? Meanwhile, Muriang trembled and wept in fear. Fatally wounded, Murimyong fell to his knees, strength draining from his body. A hollow realization surfaced in his mind that broken people could not be mended. As his vision blurred, he saw a mysterious group and their masters drawing nearer. The hooded figures advanced toward him. Muriang looked at them in pure desperation. Appearing terrified and pleading as though burdened by some unforgivable sin, the red-hooded men ignored his words and unsheathed their swords. Even on the brink of death, Murimyong attempted to resist. With the final remnants of strength he possessed, he tried to grasp a blade and defend himself. In that fleeting moment, he turned his gaze toward Muriang and wondered whether the young master had truly believed they would spare him after offering up his head. Had he genuinely thought the demon cult would restore the clan he himself had destroyed? Had he truly believed betrayal was the path to survival? With unrestrained fury, Murimyong declared that Muriang had been wrong. A thunderclap split the sky, illuminating a new horror. The mysterious figures were revealed to be members of the demon cult. One of them possessed eyes and a mouth that sealed shut in the most grotesque manner imaginable. Another wore a demonic mask and carried souvenirs taken from his victims. At the sight of them, Muriang trembled in terror. Murimyong reflected that if Muriang had wished to live, he should never have involved such monsters. At that moment, an old man raised a massive weapon intending to strike down the young master. Muriang attempted to flee, but the blow had already begun its descent. The enormous blade crashed down instantly, obliterating the traitor. Watching the scene unfold, Murimyong felt only hollow regret. He concluded that from the very beginning, he should never have served the first son. Agonizing upon the ground, he silently questioned his former master, wondering if he was watching. The first son had not been worth protecting. He bitterly admitted that he should have abandoned that trash long ago. With no strength left to resist, Murimyong let the sword fall from his hand and dropped fully to his knees. He lifted his vacant gaze toward the rain-drenched sky as the demon cult members approached. Blame was meaningless now. Only regret remained. He remembered that he had originally possessed no name. After being taken in by the head of the heavenly clan, he had been called Murimyong, a name meaning nameless. Now staring at the sky, he accepted his fate. If granted another life, he hoped he would bear a name of his own. As the cultists struck him down, he harbored one final wish: that he would never again be born as himself. Thus the nameless man died. Yet even after everything, he felt an intense chill. He fleetingly thought that death was a cold thing. When he opened his eyes, however, he found himself in an entirely different place. A girl was washing his feet. He sprang up in alarm, startling her so violently that she fell backward. Confusion overwhelmed him. He realized he was alive despite being certain his body had been riddled with blades. Before he could gather his thoughts, the kneeling girl began apologizing profusely, stating that she had not realized the water had grown cold and that she would immediately heat it again. Recognizing her, Murimyong asked whether she was Wolyong. He recalled that she had once been the personal maid who served the first son since childhood, the one constantly abused by him. Wolyong begged for forgiveness, pleading that the young master find it in his heart to pardon her. To her astonishment, he told her it was fine and instructed her to forget it. Then he asked why she was calling him young master, and more importantly, where the first son Cheon Muriang was. Liang, visibly surprised, informed him that he himself was the young master Qion Mu Riang. In utter disbelief, Liang touched his face frantically. He rushed to the water basin and saw Mu Riang's reflection staring back at him. He recoiled in horror, wondering what madness had occurred. Later that night, seated alone in his chamber, he reflected deeply. After repeatedly confirming his circumstances, he concluded that this was no dream. Somehow he had returned 15 years into the past within the body of the first son. He recalled asking Liang earlier whether anyone named Mumiang existed within the clan. To his astonishment, she had stated she had never heard such a name. He realized then that by becoming Qion Mu Riang, Mumiang had ceased to exist. Opening the window, he contemplated that perhaps this was an opportunity, a chance to protect the heavenly clan with his own hands. The method did not yet matter. He would determine that as he proceeded. He had time. The clan would not fall for another 15 years, as he surveyed the room. However, a new irritation arose. He questioned why the first son's chamber was so pitiful, scarcely larger than a trainee's quarters. His gaze then settled upon a sword bathed in blue light. The sight triggered the memory of the moment when the young master had stabbed him with that very blade. It was the heavenly light sword, the legendary weapon said to have been forged from a solitary ray of light piercing the darkness, a treasure bestowed solely upon the first son of the heavenly clan. Holding the sword in both hands, he wondered whether that meant the heavenly light sword now belonged to him. Excitement surged through him, quickening his heartbeat. Drawing the blade, he studied his reflection in its surface. Determination ignited within his eyes. He concluded that the sword was on an entirely different level from any weapon he had wielded before. He began testing it within the confines of his chamber. Yet the young master's heavy, untrained body could not keep pace with the rhythm of his movements. After only a few swings, he was utterly exhausted. Weakness overwhelmed him, and he collapsed to the ground, unable to move. He was shocked to realize that his breathing and muscles had already reached their limits from such minimal exertion. Later that night, beneath the full moon, he resolved to investigate the root of the problem. Sitting cross-legged, he entered meditation. Even if Mu Riang had neglected his training, he reasoned that he should at least be capable of wielding a sword a few times. Normally, internal energy was cultivated within the dantian and flowed through the meridians. Yet as he analyzed Mu Riang's body, he detected something deeply abnormal. A massive quantity of energy was trapped within the dantian, unable to circulate into the meridians. Worse still, the conflicting energies clashed violently, damaging both the meridians and the dantian. Strained and contemplative, he concluded that this resembled the classic conditions suffered by wealthy heirs who overdosed on rare elixirs, a golden spoon chi deviation. The following day at the training grounds, several clan members practiced with wooden swords. One youth was struck sharply upon the head and erupted in fury, accusing his opponent of recklessness and demanding to know why he had aimed for the head with full force during a spar. He insisted he had heard something crack and threatened retaliation if such aggression continued. The victor mocked him, telling him to stop acting timid and reminding him that he had promised victory with one hand. He demanded payment for the lost bet and proposed higher stakes if the other remained dissatisfied. As the fallen youth grumbled that the round did not count, the victor's attention shifted. He spotted the first son training with a wooden sword. Shocked, he questioned whether that truly was the first son and remarked that it was the first time he had ever seen him on the training grounds. Another scoffed, wondering what that trash was doing there. Meanwhile, Mumiang was internally aghast. His body could scarcely manage even a wooden sword. Setting it aside, he acknowledged that swordsmanship was impossible in such condition. When someone taunted him for giving up so quickly, he resolved upon a new priority: he would run. Losing excess weight was essential. He began running around the training grounds with unwavering determination. The onlookers observed him with disdain and confusion. Some noted that he showed no intention of leaving. One bully, wearing a sinister smile, declared that he would ensure the young master regretted ever stepping onto the training grounds. While running, Mumiang was utterly exhausted, sweat pouring down his face, as his breath came in ragged bursts. As he continued sprinting despite the strain, he thought that this situation was far worse than he had anticipated. At present, Qion Muriang's body was in complete disarray due to the countless elixirs that had been forcefully administered to him since childhood. Those numerous elixirs were now clashing violently within his system, their incompatible energies turning toxic. Agitated, Mumiang reflected that the fool Muriang, had he devoted even a fraction of sincere effort to his martial training, would have possessed internal energy capable of inspiring envy in anyone. He concluded that the first priority was to condition this body into a state capable of properly absorbing and refining that energy. Only after stabilizing it could he even begin to consider learning the Cheon clan's secret arts. Before he could pursue that train of thought any further, a sword suddenly sliced past his face, narrowly missing him and catching him completely off guard. The force of the impact sent the weapon spinning through the air before it embedded itself into the wall. Staring at it, Mumyong registered that it was no practice weapon but a real sword. As he turned his head, he saw the same bully standing there with a smug smile. The man offered a mock apology, claiming that his hand had slipped during the spar. Behind him, his companion burst into laughter, clearly entertained by the spectacle. The expression on the assailant's face made it obvious that the entire incident had been deliberate. Mumyong glared at them, inwardly cursing them as wretched bastards. The bullies gathered together, one of them remarking in a tone dripping with false concern that the place was more dangerous than it appeared. Another added that the young master might get hurt by accident and suggested that it would be wiser for him to remain confined to his room, as he usually did. Observing their behavior, Mumyong realized that this was the true state of affairs. The bully with the supercilious smile gazed at him contemptuously and thought that the fat pig had only his parents to thank for his status. He questioned how someone so worthless dared to crawl into that space. He further assumed that after such a warning the young master would scurry back to his quarters in humiliation. Instead, Mumyong offered a feigned apology accompanied by a faintly smug grin. He thanked them for their supposed concern and stated that he would indeed be careful. Immediately afterward, he resumed running as though nothing had occurred. The surrounding apprentices erupted into laughter, teasing their leader and asking what was happening. Noting that the pigmaster was actually enduring it, others remarked with surprise that he was truly staying. They collected the wager money from the bully and, with their winnings in hand, decided to go out drinking to celebrate their effortless profit. However, the bully leader remained behind with a grimacing expression. He muttered inwardly about that fat bastard Cheon Muriang. Meanwhile, Mumyong continued running without pause. He reflected that these warriors were openly looking down on their own master, a disgraceful state of affairs. Nevertheless, he resolved to endure it, acknowledging that if a fight broke out, he would unquestionably lose. Someone of his experience could determine that merely by observation. He reassured himself that it was acceptable for now. The Cheon clan's secret arts, which he had longed to study in his previous life, should be housed within the Heavenly Dragon Library. With determination burning in his eyes, he reasoned that as the first son Cheon Muriang, he should unquestionably possess the authority to enter the library. Upon arriving at the Heavenly Dragon Library, he encountered a guard stationed at the entrance with visible irritation. Mumyong asked the guard to repeat what he had just said. The gruff guard stared at him in silence, gripping his spear before reiterating that Muriang, the young lord of the Cheon clan, had been stripped of his title, and therefore entry into the Heavenly Dragon Library was denied. The guards physically barred his path. Defeated and powerless to contest the decision, Mumyong turned away and left. Returning to his small room, he sat heavily upon his bed, exhausted from the events of the day. Alone in that confined space, he realized that the reason for the room's modest size now made sense. Stripped of the young patriarch title, he wore a gloomy expression as he contemplated that since he had intended to find a method within the library to rapidly absorb the elixir energy, he would now have to devise an alternative approach. Raising his head, he reflected that Muriang's childhood had not been smooth either. Memories surfaced of a body ruined by elixir side effects, surrounded only by enemies and subordinates who mocked their master. On top of that, Muriang had been a loner much like himself. He wondered whether that isolation had driven him to his disastrous choices. Perhaps Muriang had believed he had no one on his side. Perhaps he had even thought that Mumyong, his escort warrior, was an enemy. Clenching his fist, Mumyong rejected those thoughts, declaring internally that he did not need such excuses. With a furious expression, he concluded that Muriang had brought in the demonic cult, and as a result the Cheon clan had been annihilated. That was the unvarnished truth. The absence of allies had been the natural consequence of Muriang's own behavior. Mumyong reflected that he too had been a loner, but only because he had been wholly absorbed in martial arts training. Noticing a food box beside him, he opened the lid and wondered whether Wolyong had prepared it. Seeing that it contained mushrooms, he remarked inwardly that she could at least have included some meat, as it was bland as he ate. He questioned how Muriang had managed to become so fat on such simple meals. Still, he acknowledged that there had been one person. Muriang had possessed a single ally. The next morning, Mumyong rose early to train in the backyard. He marveled at what kind of body could become overwhelmed by something as simple as a warm-up. At that moment, Woliang entered and observed that he was already awake. She asked whether he intended to train again that day. Mumiang responded affirmatively, though somewhat awkwardly. She wished him a good day as she was. Moving from there, he asked whether the bundle she carried was his laundry. Frightened, Woliang apologized, explaining that she had intended to wash it sooner, but had waited for him, so she could complete the task before sleeping, only to doze off instead. Mumiang regarded her with a faint smile and thought that she did not appear capable of being much help, yet she was his only ally nonetheless. Approaching her, he caused her to flinch in surprise. Placing his hand gently upon her shoulder, he thanked her for her hard work. Woliang was stunned by the sudden change in his demeanor and asked what he meant. He apologized and then requested that she work a little harder for him, mentioning that there would likely be much more laundry for a while after he departed. Woliang remained standing there, blushing and unable to comprehend the abrupt transformation in her young master. Night eventually fell, yet Mumiang did not cease his relentless training. He ran through the mansion courtyard, without pause, drenched in sweat, pushing himself to lose weight. He was so exhausted that he felt as though he might die. Memories of his past training resurfaced, his instructor screaming at him, demanding to know where he thought he was striking and whether he had completely lost his senses. The instructor had mocked him for wanting to attend the New Year's festival, calling him an ungrateful rascal despite being fed and clothed. He had ordered Mumiang to perform the Know Your Place downward, strike 100 times as punishment. Young Mumiang had accepted the discipline in silence. Meanwhile, he had seen young Murim joyfully urging his father to hurry so they would not miss the lantern parade, the acrobatics, and the fireworks. Left alone, Mumiang had wondered whether he had ever made a single decision for himself. There had been no choice. He had wielded the sword solely to repay the grace of the patriarch who had taken in a nameless orphan. Returning to the present, he found it almost amusing to recall his past. Woliang watched him from a corner, concern evident on her face. Eventually, overwhelmed by overtraining, he collapsed and lost consciousness. She rushed to carry him inside, though his body had failed him. He remained faintly aware and noted with surprise that Woliang was stronger than she appeared. The following day, despite heavy rain, Mumiang continued training. The group of bullies appeared once more. One complained that the prince had come again and remarked that he was persistent even in such weather. The leader begrudgingly handed over a bag of money, having lost another bet. He was mockingly addressed as Nungrio, and someone remarked that he had lost again because he always wagered that the young master would not show up. Nungrio glared at Mumiang with hostility and shouted in irritation, questioning why he was acting that way and complaining that it was pathetic for him to pretend to train now. One companion cautioned him to lower his voice, warning that the prince might hear. Nungrio dismissed the concern, retorting that it did not matter as the young master had already lost his title and been expelled from his quarters. He asserted that even if that deadbeat became patriarch, he would wield no real authority. When asked what he meant, Nungrio explained that the Council of Elders existed, and above all, Unit Commander Cheon Sianhak would never obey the eldest young master's orders. Another agreed, and Nungrio elaborated that in the end, disciples would align themselves either with Commander Sianhak's armed forces or with the Council of Elders. Those were the only two viable paths. Frankly, even if the eldest young master ascended as patriarch, he would be powerless over them. Another companion urged him to stop accusing him of acting out merely because he had lost the bet. The group departed cheerfully, remarking that thanks to the eldest young master, they had made easy money again. Nungrio, however, continued glaring at the training prince with aggression, wondering irritably whether he believed that pretending to have come to his senses would restore his former title. Mumiang briefly stopped running, and Nungrio suspected that he had overheard everything, though he pretended otherwise. Woliang, who had been standing nearby holding fabrics, observed Nungrio with a serious expression, her disapproval clearly visible. The next morning at the training ground, Mumiang took a sword from the rack, lifting it with steady confidence. He tested its weight with measured swings. He concluded that he had built enough stamina to wield a blade properly. If he combined sword arts with his training, the absorption of the elixirs would accelerate even further. Suddenly, he heard Woliang's voice demanding that someone take back what had been said. Turning toward the sound, he saw that the bullies had cornered her. She was shouting at them not to insult the young master. Surprised by her courage, Mumiang watched as Nungrio threatened her. She glared at him with intense disdain. Even Nungrio seized her by the collar. He, wearing an openly antagonistic expression, demanded to know what she had just said. Woliang, refusing to yield an inch, answered without hesitation that she had told him to retract his insult toward the young master. From the background, the other men mocked the unfolding confrontation, remarking that it seemed Nungryo had once again been bad-mouthing the grand young master, only this time the maid had overheard him. Amused and uninterested in intervening, they decided to leave the two behind and continue on their own. Nungryo shot Woliang a venomous glare and denounced her as insolent, demanding to know how a mere maid dared to speak to him in such a manner. Yet she did not even flinch in the face of his rage. Her unshaken composure only deepened his fury. Losing all restraint, he drew his sword and thought coldly that he would press the blade against her throat to see whether that arrogance would persist. Just as he moved to bring the steel to her neck, another blade flashed into existence, intercepting his strike at the final instant and hurling him backward. Stunned, Nungryo staggered and turned only to find Mumiang standing directly before Woliang, his sword leveled with unwavering precision. The sheer suddenness of Mumiang's appearance left Nungryo momentarily speechless. Mumiang ordered him to direct his sword toward him instead. Confusion flickered across Nungryo's face, but Mumiang continued, stating that if he had anything to say to Woliang, he should say it to him. Behind them, Woliang stood frozen in disbelief at the young master's words. Nungryo asked whether he was being challenged to a duel. Mumiang scoffed and replied that it need not be called a duel, perhaps it would be more fitting to call it a life or death match. He declared that if Nungryo won, he would not hold the incident against him, nor would he ever set foot in the training grounds again. He asked whether that was sufficient. Alarmed, Woliang attempted to stop him, thinking desperately that he had not even held a sword for the past month, and that this madness had to be halted. Yet Mumiang ignored her pleas. With deliberate resolve, he drove a wooden sword into the ground, marking the commencement of the duel. She was utterly stunned by the force and decisiveness of that gesture. With a contumacious expression, he reflected inwardly that he could endure insults directed at himself, but he would never tolerate insults aimed at someone who cared for him. As Woliang tried again to intervene, memories from his past life surfaced, reinforcing his conviction. He commanded Nungryo once more to raise his sword. Nungryo asked for his word. Mumiang assured him that he would not retract it. Seeing no retreat from this path, Nungryo assumed his stance and thought that although he had not expected such behavior from the grand young master, there was no alternative now. The young master had sworn not to hold it against him. If he won, so victory was all that mattered. Confident in his superior strength, speed, and swordsmanship, he convinced himself that the so-called scoundrel stood no chance. Suddenly an aura began to emanate from Mumiang's body, palpable and oppressive. Nungryo felt a flicker of genuine fear and wondered what that inexplicable spirit was. With a gaze burning in fury, Mumiang asked him why he was retreating in fear. As Nungryo stepped back instinctively, Mumiang declared that if he would not approach, then he would. He surged forward in a direct, unhesitating assault, his movement shockingly swift. Nungryo narrowly evaded the strike, and with a mocking glare thought that the attempt had been bold, but too slow that he could see through every motion. He questioned how someone of such perceived skill dared to issue a life or death challenge. However, the moment their blades met, an intense glow erupted at the point of contact, catching Nungryo completely off guard. The force of the impact sent his sword spiraling into the air. It descended and embedded itself into the ground before him. In the same breath, Mumiang's blade came to rest against his neck. Nungryo's eyes widened in absolute shock, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. He realized with dawning horror that Mumiang had never targeted him directly. His true aim had been the sword itself. When Nungryo had raised his weapon to block, Mumiang had redirected that very force to disarm him. He wondered whether the Cheon family even possessed such a technique, and when that despised scoundrel had grown so formidable. With his blade steady at Nungryo's throat, Mumiang reminded him that this had been declared a life or death match, yet he had swung his sword carelessly despite facing an opponent. He questioned whether that was truly what the Cheon family taught its disciples. Overwhelmed, Nungryo collapsed to his knees. Mumiang called him pathetic and turned away, holding his opponent's weapon. He declared that Nungryo did not deserve to wield that sword. Blood trickled from Mumiang's own hand, a silent testament to the sheer force he had exerted. He instructed Nungryo to reflect on why he wished to hold a sword at all, and when he found that answer, to seek him out again. Only then would he face him once more over that blade. Left kneeling, Nungryo remained in stunned reflection, his hand outstretched as though grasping for understanding. The other men stood in mute disbelief as Mumiang called for Woliang and departed with her, walking past the group without a second glance. As they returned to their quarters, Woliang suddenly fell to her knees, apologizing profusely. She confessed that she should not have stepped forward, explaining that when she heard them mocking his efforts, anger had overtaken her. Guilt weighed heavily upon her as she lamented that he had even injured his hand because of her, and that she should have maintained composure. Hearing her words, Mumiang reflected that the injury had resulted from employing a technique too advanced for his current body. It was not her fault, though there was no way he could explain such a truth. He told her she need not apologize at all, reminding her that she had stood up for him. She looked at him in astonishment as he continued, stating that he could endure insults aimed at himself, but he would never tolerate insults towards someone who cared for him. With a determined gaze and a faint smile, he vowed that to protect his people he would tolerate no such disrespect regardless of who stood before him. Tears welled in Wuliang's eyes as she was struck by the echo of an old New Year's wish from her childhood. She remembered the young Murim declaring that he would grow strong, become a family head as mighty as an elephant, and protect everyone. He had proclaimed that he would begin sword training the very next day and had even promised to protect her despite her being taller at the time. Returning to the present, she wiped away tears of joy, convinced that the grand young master she once knew had returned. Their quiet moment was abruptly shattered by a furious voice demanding whether Mumiang could take responsibility for those words. Startled, Mumiang instinctively raised his sword, uncertain of the voice's origin. An imposing figure emerged, Muriang's uncle, one of the three pillars supporting the Cheon family, and the Grand Master of both the Heavenly Dragon Sword Corps and the Heavenly Phoenix Sword Corps, with unrestrained fury. The elder demanded once more whether Mumiang could bear responsibility for what he had said. He was Cheon Sianhak. Mumiang greeted him respectfully, admitting that he had been ignorant and had failed to pay his respects. Inwardly, he remembered that in his previous life, Sianhak had been the one he trusted and followed most, never imagining they would meet again under such strange circumstances. Sianhak dismissed the courtesies as pathetic, demanding a direct answer rather than half-hearted formalities. Mumiang observed the same cold disdain in his uncle's gaze that had existed 15 years prior, recalling how Sianhak had once declared the Grand Young Master beyond reform. Mumiang replied that as the Grand Young Master, he would never utter words he could not uphold. He affirmed that protecting his people was his conviction. Sianhak's fury intensified. He questioned how Mumiang dared to speak of protecting his people or of conviction, claiming that his mouth defiled such words. He then demanded to know about the sword technique used in the duel, the Heavenly Dragon Sword Dragon Claw, a secret art of the Heavenly Dragon Sword Corps. He asserted that since Mumiang was not a member of the Corps, he could not have learned it legitimately. Therefore, he must have acquired it from a traitor within the Corps, someone who cared about him and thus belonged among the people he claimed to protect. With choleric severity, Sianhak declared that he would uncover the traitor and punish them without mercy. Anyone who sheltered such a person would suffer the same fate. He challenged Mumiang to attempt to protect them, as he had so boldly claimed. If he had failed, Sianhak would hold him accountable for the disturbance and ban him from the training grounds permanently. Mumiang understood that the Grand Master intended to exploit this incident as justification to expel him entirely, having long regarded him with distaste. Under the weight of his uncle's contemptuous glare, he recognized that his next words would determine everything, and thus he considered them with the utmost care. He met his uncle's gaze without flinching and declared that there had been no traitor. Sianhak was visibly shaken by the answer. Mumiang reflected inwardly that the one who had taught him had been none other than the Grand Master himself in his previous life. He then explained to his uncle that he had merely copied the Dragon Claw technique after witnessing it by chance. At those words, Sianhak let out a derisive, mocking laugh, while the Grand Master burst into loud amusement. Yet the mirth vanished as abruptly as it had begun. Sianhak's expression hardened. His face grew severe as he thundered that the claim was utterly ridiculous. In a surge of fury, he drew his sword, a formidable aura erupting from him. With eyes blazing crimson, he demanded how someone like Mumiang could possibly imitate such a technique after seeing it only once, and ordered him to draw his blade at once. Caught off guard, Mumiang felt tension coil within him. He had not anticipated such an escalation. A powerful red aura enveloped Sianhak, his glare fierce and appalled. Simultaneously anxious, yet faintly frustrated, Mumiang insisted that he had already spoken the truth. If disbelief persisted, he proposed that the Grand Master demonstrate another technique unfamiliar to him, promising that he would replicate that as well. Sianhak fell momentarily speechless. His sharp gaze shifted to Mumiang's injured hand, where blood began to drip steadily onto the ground. With evident disappointment, he accused him of continuing to lie merely to escape the moment, declaring that enough was enough, and that he could no longer trust a single word he uttered. Turning away, he called out to Wuliang, addressing her as the young master's maid. Terrified by the summons, she trembled as he demanded that she speak and reveal whatever scheme the scoundrel she served was plotting. With an infuriated glare, he warned that if she dared utter a lie, he would cut her down on the spot. Overwhelmed by fear, her hands shook as she replied that for the past month the young master had been smiling constantly. Sihak stared at her in surprise and asked incredulously whether she meant that brat who had always erupted in anger from his inferiority complex. Still trembling, she affirmed his words and added that even while running laps around the training grounds, the grand young master had continued to smile. As she spoke, Mumion cast a sharp glance at her and realized that she had observed everything. With sincerity stirring within him, he reflected that for the first time in his life, he had been happy simply to work hard for himself. Wolion continued explaining to the Grand Master that even when others sneered at him, he had not so much as glanced in their direction. In the past, he would have either flared up in anger or fled in humiliation, but this time he had done neither. Instead, for the first time, he had drawn his sword for her sake. With unwavering conviction, she declared that the young master had changed, and affirmed confidently that she believed in him. Confronted by the servant's passionate defense, Sihak paused in contemplation and asked whether she truly meant that he had changed. He then turned to Mumion and demanded to know which martial art he had mastered. Mumion replied that he knew only the Heavenly Sun divine art. Sihak observed that this made him no different from the other trainees. Raising 2 fingers, he imposed a deadline of 2 months to defeat the top trainee, declaring that only then would he attempt to believe him. Fixing him with a penetrating glare, he demanded to know whether he could accomplish it. Mumion smiled inwardly, recalling how he had always been tested in such a manner. With calm confidence, he responded that 1 month would suffice. Sihak regarded him with an unreadable expression before sheathing his sword, accepting the proposed deadline and departing. Mumion also turned to leave, asking Wolion to return with him, adding that he intended to run a little longer. She agreed happily. Half a month later, his steady hands gripped the sword hilt, revealing that he was no longer the same person. In a sudden burst of motion, he unleashed a powerful vertical strike, cleaving the air with violence and precision. Drenched in sweat from relentless training, he reflected that he had practically lived in the training grounds for the past fortnight and had advanced to the 5th level of the Heavenly Sun divine art. Through that progress, he had nearly dissolved the yang energy within his body. Yet the yin energy, distinct in nature from the Heavenly Sun divine art, remained beyond his control. Gazing at his hand, he lamented inwardly that had he learned a higher cultivation method from the Heavenly Dragon Library, matters might have been different. Noticing that the wound on his hand had healed, he wished that his energy center might mend itself just as easily. While he was absorbed in thought, several apprentices mocked him. One remarked that he had been given a public opportunity to strike down the grand young master. Among them stood the foremost trainee, while other comments to lower their voices lest he overhear and flee before the match began. Another scoffed that it would make no difference, as all he did day and night was repeat downward strikes. A predictable end awaited him. Mumion understood that the spreading rumors had likely been the Grand Master's intention to intimidate him into surrendering early, yet he betrayed no reaction. One of the men lounging in a chair sneered that perhaps the young master could not distinguish between hoeing a field and practicing sword forms. Laughter erupted around them. Unperturbed, Mumion approached and inquired whether he was the top trainee. The man replied with a mocking smile that he was indeed, and assured him that he would conclude the match gently. Studying his face, Mumion felt a flicker of recognition and asked for his name. The man introduced himself as Lee Suki. At the sound of that name, memory surged forth. Though his features appeared sharper, now Mumion realized that this was the very man who had once leaked information about the Cheon family to the demon cult. Rage flared within him, his teeth grinding as he turned away and declared that he would remember the name. Suki responded sardonically that it was an honor, young master. As he departed, Mumion reflected that he had originally intended simply to do his best regardless of his opponent. But that resolve shifted. With cold fury in his eyes, he vowed that Lee Suki would pay. Another half-month passed, and the day of the match arrived. Amid the gathered crowd, one spectator eagerly anticipated witnessing the grand young master's humiliating defeat. Another admitted that he seemed somewhat changed of late. Suddenly, the judge commanded absolute silence and announced the commencement of the long-awaited family event arranged by Grandmaster Cheon Sihak. He summoned the challenger Lee Suki to step forward and called for Murim as well. Suki entered the arena with a confident smirk, sword raised, anticipating certain victory. The judge called out Murim's name once more, Yet to everyone's astonishment, Mumyong was nowhere to be seen. Confusion spread as the judge stared toward the empty entrance. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One voice suggested that he had not even come to the training grounds and had fled. Laughter followed, and Sian-hak's expression darkened with disappointment, while Siaki's smirk deepened. Then a voice cut through the derision, declaring that Muriang was already present. All eyes turned toward the speaker in shock. At that moment, Mumyong walked calmly into the arena prepared for battle. The crowd gasped in disbelief. One wondered where the pig had gone, while another asked who the unfamiliar figure was. Gradually, recognition dawned as whispers spread that the face seemed strangely familiar. The unrecognizable figure standing there, lean, composed, and confident, was none other than Mumyong himself transformed. With serene composure, he introduced himself as Cheon Muriang and declared that he was ready to fight. He left the entire assembly speechless. Shock rippled outward like a silent tremor. Whispers spread through the crowd as they struggled to comprehend how he could have shed so much weight in so little time. It defied their sense of reason. Disregarding the murmuring spectators, he lifted his gaze toward his uncle, offered a respectful greeting, and apologized for his tardiness. Sian-hak frowned. Impatience etched across his features, and brusquely told him to dispense with formalities, adding that he trusted he had come prepared. Without the slightest hesitation, Mumyong spun his wooden sword with effortless precision and declared that he was more than ready to accept the challenge. From a distance, Suki observed in silence, inwardly questioning the irritating confidence on his opponent's face. He wondered whether losing a bit of weight had inflated his courage. Deeming it absurd that someone who had swung a blade for merely a month would dare to confront him, his eyes drifted upward toward the stands where the authorities were seated, and he questioned what the Grandmaster could possibly be thinking. Yet he conceded inwardly that the situation worked in his favor. Not only the Grandmaster, but even the Heavenly Dragon Sword Captain and the Heavenly Phoenix Sword Captain were present, his expressions tinged with sardonic curiosity. Suki resolved to seize this opportunity to carve a lasting impression upon them. Observing Siaki's expression, Mumyong discerned that he had already been dismissed. He could almost hear the calculations unfolding behind that smirk, the scheming to curry favor with superiors. His gaze darkened as he reflected that Lee Suki was precisely the sort of man he remembered, a sly, festering parasite who clung to power by exploiting others. Memories surged unbidden. After Suki had entered the Heavenly Dragon Sword Corps, he had ascended not through the purity of his blade, but through insidious politics. With honeyed words and feigned loyalty, he had sold every fragment of information he could to the demonic cult, blinded by insatiable greed. The bitterness of that betrayal returned sharply. In his previous life, he had failed to pass judgment. Now, standing before his enemy once more, he acknowledged that Suki had not yet committed that crime. But that was precisely why he needed to be stopped before history repeated itself. Until now, everything had unfolded according to Siaki's design, enabling him to rise to the rank of top trainee. Mumyong allowed himself the faintest smile, thinking that it was unfortunate for Suki, for he knew him too well. Gripping his weapon with quiet resolve, he resolved that Siaki's ascent would end here. From above, Sian-hak announced that the match would continue until he declared it finished, emphasizing that it was not a duel to the death. Hearing the conditions, Mumyong tightened his grip. His focus sharpened solely upon crushing his opponent. Suki, meanwhile, maintained an arrogant smile, confident that he would humiliate the so-called scoundrel with ease. Without further delay, Sian-hak unleashed a commanding shout, signaling the commencement of the duel. Mumyong moved first, exploding forward in a blur of speed. The sudden charge caught Suki momentarily off guard. Mumyong soared high into the air. Siaki's expression turned malevolent as he recalled hearing that Mumyong had defeated Nungrio in a similar fashion, seizing the initiative and employing a peculiar technique to knock aside his opponent's blade. With a smirk, Suki raised his sword and inwardly challenged him to attempt the same maneuver again. As Mumyong descended to strike, Suki braced himself, silently daring him to deflect the blow. Their wooden swords collided with a resounding crack. To Mumyong's surprise, Suki successfully blocked the attack. A ferocious smile spread across Siaki's face as he retaliated. His wooden blade descended with terrifying pressure, cleaving through the air toward Mumyong. The impact was imminent. Forced into defense, Mumyong raised his weapon to absorb the crushing strength. Suki pressed his advantage relentlessly, attacking from behind as well. Yet Mumyong refused to remain static. With fluid agility, he slid aside and attempted to circle around for a counterattack. Even as he moved, Suki reflected that he had initially intended to show mercy for the dignity of the grand young master. However, with so many high-ranking masters observing, he could not squander this chance. Driven by ambition, he unleashed his full strength, seizing Mumyong's hands. He reversed his wooden sword and struck brutally at his stomach. Mumyong gritted his teeth, struggling beneath the unexpected weight of the blow. Then Suki resorted to a dishonorable tactic, delivering a vicious kick to Mumyong's abdomen. The force sent him hurtling backward. Though he managed to regain his balance before collapsing entirely, Siaki's aura flared ominously. With a sinister expression, he instructed the grand young master to watch closely, and lunged forward once more. Mumyong's eyes widened at the incoming strike. The blade hurtled toward him with terrifying velocity. In a split second, his sword fell from his grasp as Suki aimed for his shoulder. A sickening sound reverberated through the arena as the weapon struck his body. The pain was excruciating, and a cry escaped him. With smug satisfaction, Suki remarked upon the disparity in their levels as Mumyong dropped to his knees. Casting a glance toward the Grand Master, Suki reflected that it was unfortunate his opponent was someone like Mumyong. Yet defeating him would suffice to demonstrate his own prowess. Raising his fist in triumph, he felt assured that events had unfolded precisely as anticipated. He looked down at his fallen opponent with a victorious smile. Then something felt amiss. The arena had fallen into an unnatural silence. He wondered why he could hear nothing at all. In the next instant, he noticed something profoundly strange. The training ground appeared tilted as though lying on its side. Disoriented, he blinked repeatedly, but the sensation of confusion overwhelmed him. Footsteps thudded firmly against the ground beside his face. Turning his head with difficulty, he saw Mumyong standing over him. Confusion seized him. Why was Mumyong upright while he himself lay prone? Mumyong offered a faint mocking smile and calmly inquired whether he had enjoyed his brief nap. Suki struggled to process the situation. Drool slipped from the corner of his mouth as he questioned why he was on the ground, why his body refused to respond. Something nearby caught his eye. His gaze widened in horror as he saw his shattered wooden sword. Memory returned in a violent rush when Mumyong had leapt into the air to strike. The force of his counterattack had been overwhelming. Rather than retreating, Mumyong had advanced, turning Siaki's own strength against him. The impact had splintered Siaki's sword in a single decisive blow. In one seamless motion, Mumyong had driven the hilt of the broken blade into Siaki's forehead. The sheer violence of the strike had rendered him unconscious before he struck the ground. Now back in the present, Suki lay defeated, stunned that he had fallen to someone he had so thoroughly underestimated. Mumyong regarded him coldly and whispered that he was a potential traitor. Suki, unable to hear clearly, wondered what he had just been called. Mumyong informed him that he would be spared for the moment, but warned him to watch his conduct carefully, adding that he would be observing him from now on. Suki rationalized that he had merely let his guard slip, that anyone would falter against a supposedly insignificant opponent who had trained only a few months. Yet as he gazed at Mumyong, a darker realization crept in. His reputation was in ruins. The crowd erupted into stunned murmurs. One voice questioned whether the match had already ended. Another echoed in disbelief that it had concluded in a single move. Others confirmed that it had indeed been decided in one strike. Meanwhile, Woleong could no longer restrain her emotions. Tears streamed down her face. Tears of overwhelming relief and joy at her master's safety and victory. Mumyong ignored the swelling uproar and turned his gaze toward the tower where the Grand Master sat. Sianhak grunted, his expression a complex blend of surprise and irritation. The breeze stirred Mumyong's garments as he stood tall within the arena, quiet confidence radiating from his bearing. Sianhak returned his stare without uttering a word. The crowd descended into fervent speculation, debating whether the top trainee had truly fallen in a single strike, or whether some hidden trick had been employed. Among them, one man clenched his fist. Struggling to suppress his frustration, he reflected bitterly that the fool had squandered a perfect opportunity to expel that scoundrel from the training grounds. Grinding his teeth in indignation, he found Mumyong's victory utterly intolerably infuriating.